Hi, I'm Mike. Welcome back to the shop. The next project I'm going to work on is to rebuild this Triumph Spitfire 1500 single rail gearbox. This is a gearbox I bought several years ago as a replacement for my original gearbox in my Spitfire while I rebuilt that original gearbox. It's time to have this gearbox rebuilt, and I'll show you how it's done. Okay, to disassemble the unit, one of the first steps to do is to remove the 5/16 inch nut which holds the output shaft flange. It's easiest if you use a impact wrench because the unit will spin. So if you try to do it by hand, it'll take a lot of effort. So make sure this is in reverse. And I'm just going to stick this on here, grab the output flange or the input flange, and go at it. Okay, you can see that with the output flange there, it's a splined fitting here. Which fits onto the spline here, and there's also a washer that is inside on the flange here where the nut will fit right up. Okay, on to the next step. The next step is to remove the 8 half-inch head, the half-inch head on the bolt. There's 8 of them, 4 on each side. So you'll need a half-inch wrench. Next, we use a 7/16 inch wrench to remove the 9 bolts around the perimeter of the gearbox cover. Okay, next, in order to get the back half of the transmission or the gearbox off, we have to be able to take this selector shaft out of the front of the gearbox. In order to do that, we have a pin which actually holds this in place, and I'll zoom in on that. That pin is in the front of the gearbox. You can see it right here. What I'm going to do is take just a nail set and or a nail setting tool and a ball peen hammer, and basically just drive that pin out of the front, and I'll save that pin and we can reuse it, and then we'll be able to pull the back half of the transmission off. Next, remove the spool plate, take out the selector rod that holds the 3rd and 4th gear selector, as well as the 1st and 2nd gear selector. Next, lift up the selector forks, turn the reverse selector shaft, and then slide it forward. Next, you can use a block of wood and a small hammer to begin tapping out the shaft, or the housing, the tail housing, off the back. This will remove the tail housing as well as the selector shaft. Make sure that you're holding up the selector forks while you're doing this, and that there's no engagement to the reverse selector lever. You can see how I have the block of wood positioned against the back here. I'm not going to hit it very hard. It'll be enough to disengage the tail shaft housing from the main case. Okay, the selector spool can now come out. The third and fourth gear, sorry, first and second gear selector fork, the first and second gear selector fork can be removed. And now you can see it all able to be spun. Next, turn the gearbox around so that you can see this. There are two shafts that need to be removed. One's a lay shaft and one's the shaft that holds the rear or reverse gear. The lay shaft is tapped out using a drift from the front. You tap it here and drive it out. Again, not very hard, just enough to get it to move. And then you just pull it out by hand. Sometimes it helps to change the orientation. To get this shaft out, there is a retaining bolt in the side, so you'll need to take that off. I think that's a 7/16 socket. I'll go grab that. It's a 1/2 inch head, so a 1/2 inch wrench. Just undo it. Take that off to the side. That'll allow the rear or the reverse shaft to come off with the bushing. And the rear gear then falls to the bottom of the casing. It won't come out until the rest of the shaft is out. So now I'm turning this back around, putting it in the same orientation we had at the beginning. And you can see that the rear gear is now at the bottom of the casing, and the selector shaft is here. So let me make sure that goes to the bottom of the casing. Okay, so now we've got the lay shaft out. The reverse gear is down the bottom of the casing, as well as the lay shaft gears are down at the bottom of the casing. Next, we direct our attention to the front of the gearbox. We need to take the input shaft and bearing out. In order to do that, we're going to have to remove the C-clip and the washer, and then. Okay, so in order to remove the C-clip, we're going to have to use the C-clip removal tool, set it to external, and we're going to stick these the points here into the holes and spread it out, And then as I'm spreading it, I'm going to take a screwdriver at the other end. You could use a pick as well, but as I spread it, I'll put the screwdriver in to pull it off the shaft. This is my favorite tool. Hate these things. That's off. I'll be replacing this in during the refurb. Oh, by the way, also you're going to see these needle bearings coming out as you're doing some disassembly. Don't worry about keeping track of these. We'll be replacing those as well. Okay. Next, we need to again on the back side we have a clip that holds the bearing race in place here. We need to remove that clip so that we can drive the gear train forward in order to get the front out. So there it goes. I will be replacing that as well. Okay, so now I have the retaining ring that holds the front bearing in place, and what I'm going to do is also use the C-clip removal tool, but this case all I'm going to do is stick the two pins in here and spread it and then move it forward. Quite easily done. Do the same thing on the back spring and the back bearing. Okay, so now that the snap rings have been removed from both the rear bearing and the front bearing, what we'll do is use a hydraulic press to press the front bearing out. So I've got the front snout here. As we pull on this, I'll make sure that this the input shaft does not hit the ground because we don't want to damage that. There we go. Okay, I'm going to keep going and I'll get the back bearing out as well. Okay. Okay, so now here's the input shaft, and you'll see all we'll do is remove the synchro, put that aside. There is a flat washer in here as well as inside the pilot. We've got two flat washers and the bearing to go between the intermediate shaft and the input shaft, and we'll take those out and set them aside as well. Okay, so the next thing we do with the input shaft is to remove the bearing. We'll go back to our press. We're going to use a couple of plates to hold this while we press the input shaft, the top of the input shaft, in this direction to pop off the bearing. Okay, so we have a couple of arbor plates to support the bearing. The gear is not touching the arbor plate, so we're making sure that we don't damage the gear. And then I'll just hold on to the input shaft so it doesn't drop out during the process. There it goes. There we go. You also see there's a shim in behind. We'll remove that shim from the back. That was a part of the backing of the what was going between the gear and the bearing. Okay, next thing you do is take out the fork. The selector fork for the rear or for the reverse gear. You pop that out by lifting the gear train, remove that. Now that we've got the selector shaft removed, we'll lift up the gear train and then remove the reverse gear from the bottom of the gearbox. And it's just twisting it a little bit, getting around there. There's our reverse gear. Okay, in order to get the intermediate shaft out, we have to actually be able to tip this, and you'll see that the nose of the shaft is interfering with the front of the gearbox. What we're going to have to do is push the rear bearing back into the gear casing, and then continue to push the intermediate shaft in a little bit in order to give us enough clearance to get this out. So we'll set that back up on the hydraulic press. Okay, we're back on the hydraulic press, and what we're doing is again pushing this bearing back in. Okay, now the rear gear here is now contacting the back of the gearbox. Okay, I was able to get the rear bearing off after a little bit of finagling with the press. So in any case, it's off. Now we can start taking the intermediate shaft out here. In order to do that, you can actually start to remove some of the gearing, or part of the elements of the gear train. So I'm just going to start taking these things out through the front. And the side here. There we go. And now I should be able to take the bearing off the end. I'm going to have to press that off the end, and then be able to take this part of the gear train off, going the other direction of the main shaft. So I'm going to go back and press out the rear bearing all the way off of the tail shaft, and then get into the gear train itself. Okay, back off the press. Now all we have to do is tilt it, pull it out. So there's the rest of the intermediate shaft and the gear train, and you can see now the lay gear in the bottom of the gearbox. You can pull that straight out, and you'll notice that there are some roller bearings still inside the lay shaft. This one has about half of them in there as well. And if you look at the bottom of the gear case, you're going to see the thrust bearing for the lay shaft, and you're also going to see another thrust bearing for the lay shaft, and some springs and balls, ball bearings that go into the part of the synchro mechanism. So the springs and the balls, these are real painful to keep track of during the installation process. I will be buying more of these because they have a tendency to fly all over the place during the installation process. So it looks like those springs and balls are accounted for. Okay. So I'm going to put that assembly back together, just for the time being, just to make sure they don't go missing. See where the balls are here? I'm just going to push it down inside the housing here. Whoops. Try it the other way. There we go. And I'll just push that back together. There. Okay, so the balls and the springs are inside here. We'll clean those out and use them again. And just for safekeeping, I put the synchro back in. Okay, so that's the disassembly from the gear case, and then the remainder of the gears slide off. We've got some intermediate thrust washers as well as the gearing. There's another synchro. And this will slide off as well. Okay, you saw the balls and the springs come out. Put those back in. There's one, there's two, and there's the third one. Put that over to the side. Okay, there's some clip rings on the inside of here. Those clip rings have to be removed in order to get the remainder of the gear train off. And those can just be pried out with a pick or a very small screwdriver. So I'm going to go get one of those and show you how that's done. Okay, so here's the clip. What I need to do is be able to get one screwdriver going through and underneath to pry it up, and then stick another screwdriver into the slot and then get underneath it and pull it out. So here I'm going to do that. Okay, so I got both ends of the clip up and pulled around, so now I can basically just move it off. And then slide the gear off with it. So there's a There's the clip. There is a slotted washer. There's the clip. And then there's also a bushing on the inside of that gear. So we'll put those aside. And then we've got the rest of the gear train that can come off. Again, got another synchro here. And then the final part, again, the balls. Oops, right there's the balls and the springs to hold it in place. I've got the other ball that came off. I'll put that back in and install that back in here so for safekeeping. So there's the ball and spring, and I'm just going to push them all back together. Okay. So there's our intermediate shaft. So there we go. It's completely assembled, except for the only thing I didn't take out was the rear bearing as well as the selector shaft in the housing. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave those there. This bearing is not a problem, and the selector shaft is not needed to be taken apart either. Next step in the process here is to clean all the parts, do some inspection, make sure that there aren't any chips or issues with any of the parts. And we're going to buy some new bearings, some new needle bearings. These needle bearings are going to be thrown away. I think looks like the thrust washers are in pretty good stead as well. So next step is cleaning and inspection.